Children and youths of the beings who fail to observe this custom are without exception exposed to this same sexual abnormality. The second custom I mentioned, namely abdest, which by the way is called differently by the beings of different groups on the continent Asia, is nothing else than the obligatory ablution of the sex organs after every visit to what is called the toilet. Thanks chiefly to this second custom, most of your favorites breeding on the continent of Asia are safeguarded against venereal diseases and other sexual abnormalities there. Having said this, Beelzebub became thoughtful, and after a long pause said, "The present theme of our conversation has reminded me of a certain very interesting conversation which I had there during my sojourn in France with a young, sympathetic, three-brained being. I think that perhaps it would now be best for your understanding of all that has just been said if I repeat to you that conversation in full. All the more so as, besides explaining the meaning of the custom abdest or ablution, this conversation will enlighten you on many further questions concerning the peculiar psyche of these favorites of yours. This same being, my conversation with whom I recall and now intend to repeat to you, was just that young Persian who, you remember, as I've already told you, was, at the request of our mutual acquaintances, my guide in the city of Paris, where I happened to be, as I've already told you, just before my departure to this same continent, America. One day, I was waiting for this young Persian in a cafe in the city of Paris, as always the same Grand Café. When he arrived, I noticed by his eyes that this time he was, as they say there, more drunk than usual. In general, he always drank more than enough of the alcoholic liquids existing there, and when we happened to be together in Paris in the restaurants on Montmartre, where it was obligatory to order champagne, which I neither liked nor drank, he would always drink it all alone with great pleasure. Besides always drinking, he was also, as is said there, a great petticoat chaser. The moment he saw what they call there the pretty face of a being of the female sex, his whole body and even his breathing suddenly changed. When I noticed that he was this time more intoxicated than usual, and when, having sat down beside me, he ordered coffee with what is called there an apéritif, I asked him, "Explain to me, please, my young friend, why do you always drink this poison?" To this question of mine he answered, my dear doctor, I drink this poison, in the first place, because I'm so accustomed to it that I cannot now stop drinking it without suffering, and secondly, I drink it because only thanks to the effect of the alcohol can I calmly look on at the obscenity which goes on here," he added, waving his hand around. "I began drinking this, as you call it, poison, because the accidental and for me unlucky and wretched circumstances of my life were so arranged that I had to come and live a long time in this maleficent Europe. I first began to drink because everybody here whom I met also drank, and unless you drink, you are called a woman, a girl, a dolly, dearie, sissy, ninny, and similar derisive names. Not wishing my business acquaintances to call me by these offensive names, I also began to drink. And in addition, thanks also to the fact that when I first came over to Europe, conditions of life here in respect of morality and patriarchality were entirely in contrast with those conditions in which I was born and brought up, I, seeing and perceiving all this, used to experience a painful feeling of shame and an unaccountable embarrassment. At the same time, I noticed that from the effect of the alcohol I drank, not only was the depression I experienced alleviated, but I could look upon it all quite calmly, and even have the wish to participate in this abnormal life, so contradictory of my nature and my established views. Thus it came about that every time I began to feel the same unpleasant sensations, I began to drink this alcohol, even with a feeling of some self-justification, and in this way became gradually accustomed to this, as you have quite justly called it, poison. Having said this with a perceptive impulse of heartfelt grief, he paused a while to puff at his cigarette mixed with tambak, and taking this opportunity, I asked him as follows. Well, all right. Let us assume I have more or less understood your explanation of your inexcusable drunkenness, and can put myself in your position. But what do you say about your other, and from my point of view, also inexcusable vice, namely your petticoat drooling? Why, you run after every petticoat if only it hangs about someone with long hair. At this question of mine, he, sighing deeply, resumed his speaking as follows. It seems to me I got this habit as well, partly for the reason I mentioned, but I think this weakness of mine can be explained by still another very interesting psychological cause. Of course, I expressed the desire to hear him, but first I suggested our going inside that Grand Café, into the hall of the restaurant itself, as it was already getting damp out of doors. When we were seated in the hall of the restaurant and had ordered their famous champagne, he continued as follows. When you live among us in Persia, my dear doctor, you perhaps happen to observe the attitude existing there, very specific for us Persians, of men towards women. Namely, among us in Persia, men have two definite, one can say, organic attitudes towards women, in accordance with which women are, for us men, even unconsciously on our part, very sharply divided into two categories. The first attitude is towards the woman, the present or future mother, and the second towards the woman, female. The property of the men of our Persia who have in their nature data for these two independent attitudes and for this instinctive feeling began to be formed only recently, about 2.5 centuries ago. According to the explanations once given me by my mullah uncle, whom those around him called behind his back a mullah of the old school, it seems that 2 or 3 centuries ago, owing to causes evidently ensuing from certain higher world laws, men began to make war on each other everywhere on the earth, and especially among us in Asia, more intensively than usual. And at the same time, somehow, in most of the men, the feeling of piety began very distinctly to decline, and in some of them entirely disappeared. And just at that period, a certain form of psychic disease spread among men, from which many who were infected by it ultimately either became quite insane or committed suicide. Then, certain wise people of various independent